Good morning, everybody. My name is Kelsey Davenport, and I'm the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. Thank you so much for joining us today for our annual meeting and our 50th anniversary celebration. Personally, I hope we can put the Arms Control Association out of business so we don't have to come back to celebrate the 100th anniversary, but we'll see. And it really is this question of sort of looking to the future that's guiding today's panel topic, restoring nonproliferation and disarmament guardrails. And for the next hour, we're going to look at future challenges to the broader nonproliferation and disarmament regime and really see how the NPT and its related instruments can respond to those challenges to meet the array of nuclear threats that we're seeing. Because really, if we look at the regime writ large, we're facing a complex array of challenges. From a rise in nuclear threats that we heard about in the last panel, concern about the emergence of new nuclear states, and a pillar of the arms control architecture, U.S.-Russian arms control, and the future of that really being at risk. So thank you so much for joining us today to discuss these questions and more. I couldn't be more pleased with the panel that we've gathered. You have your full bios in their program, so I'm just going to read their titles. But we're going to start today with Tom Countryman. Tom is the former Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. We're also going to hear from Jamie Kwong. She is a Stanton pre-doctoral fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're going to hear from Eric Brewer, a Senior Director of the Nuclear Materials Security Program at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So, Tom, I'd like to start with you. U.S.-Russian arms control has really been a crucial element of the broader arms control and disarmament regime. And we heard from Wendy Sherman in the video just how much we've accomplished in terms of arsenal reduction since the height of the Cold War. And it would seem that President Biden really puts a high priority on this topic. I mean, one of his first actions in office was, of course, to extend New START. He resumed strategic stability talks with Moscow. So again, it seems quite clear that he views this as a priority. But given the Russian invasion in Ukraine, what can we expect from strategic stability dialogue in the future? Is there a possibility of resumption? And really, can we see future arms control between the U.S. and Russia given current geopolitics?
Well, thank you, Kelsey. First, let me say, congratulations to you and Daryl and the entire team on 50 years of effective and inspiring work. And ACA is effective in part because it is inspiring. And I'm really happy to be together again in person with members and supporters. I've been a guest at these annual meetings. I've been a host at these annual meetings. I'm back to being a guest because I'm momentarily employed by the Department of State in helping to prepare for the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in August and assisting Ambassador Scheinman in that task. Now, your question, Kelsey, you'll get a better answer from Assistant Secretary Stewart when she speaks later today. But I know you're all the impatient types. That's why you're in the arms control business. So instead of waiting for the ideal answer, I'll give you a half-decent answer. And it has to start with why it is not possible at this moment to continue the strategic stability dialogue that commenced with some promise between Moscow and Washington. It's not only that Russia's action in Ukraine has put a dent in all three pillars of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Irresponsible talk about nuclear weapons use, outright threats of nuclear weapons use, means that the important statement that 5 presidents made in January was immediately undermined by one of them before the end of February. And that can't be ignored. On the non-proliferation pillar, there are some who argue that this creates incentive for other states to pursue nuclear weapons programs. I think that concern is overstated, but the fact that it's being discussed means that the effect is real. And on peaceful uses, having active combat in a country with 15 operating nuclear reactors is a challenge to the concept of peaceful uses of nuclear energy we haven't faced before. But there's something bigger than even the effect on the Nonproliferation Treaty, and that is the truly unprecedented nature of a 21st century country reverting to 17th century behavior and treating power as a means to extend one's territorial control over its neighbor. This is a more fundamental challenge to the rules-based order in the world. I think it is more fundamental than the way many have put it as an argument between democracy and autocracy. It is a reason that there cannot be, at this moment, simply business as usual, even on a topic as crucial as strategic stability between the two powers. You're absolutely correct that President Biden is committed to this. We've never had a president come into office with such a long history and a deep interest in nuclear policy and in arms control. And he is fully aware of the need to get back onto that path. I think it's also important that, in my opinion, we've never had a president who cared so much what allies and partners and other countries think, and who has made a more intensive effort to consult with allies and non-allied friends on all manner of issues. So I think there should be no doubt about the determination of his administration to get back on track with arms control with the Russian Federation and to find the right path to open that dialogue with China as well, for which we don't have a precedent and a history. When we get there, I think the goals have already been well articulated. We have to not only continue limitations on strategic delivery vehicles, which has been the main thing that we have discussed. We have to address the question of unconventional and, in my view, irrational weapon systems and delivery systems that have been developed on the Russian side. We have to find a way to talk about so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons, although I've never met a nuclear weapon that isn't strategic. And we have to be able to put on the table as well and discuss the questions that concern the Russian Federation. There is inevitably a give and a take in any negotiation of this type. I think we will get back there, but I hope that at the base I've made clear there's a damn good reason we can't do it next week.
Well, I certainly take your point that we can't do it next week. But in a few months, the question of arms control, what's perceived as a slow pace of disarmament, frustration over the lack of progress on Article 6, all of that is going to come up if the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference is actually finally held. I'm not sure I'm going to believe it until I see it at this point, in August. So, how is the United States going to approach that review conference? How are you going to answer for this real frustration about the lack of progress on Article 6?
Yeah. Well, first let's talk about the general approach. And one of the silver linings to the health crisis of the last couple of years is that due to delay of the conference and the advent of web video technology, we have consulted more widely with more states party to the treaty than the U.S. has ever done before previous review conferences. And I think that we've been clear to all that we are looking for a positive outcome, a successful outcome at the treaty, that we will engage seriously, study every question, discuss openly what is good and what is less acceptable, and we'll work towards an outcome, whether it's a single document, as has been the case at some review conferences, or a set of documents, that has been the case at other review conferences, that accomplishes a few goals. First, it reflects a genuine, honest review of what has and hasn't worked in the treaty, where we've accomplished goals and where we have failed. Second, that it points a way forward with meaningful, achievable steps in all three pillars. But third, and since February, we have to think about something else as well. Does it speak exactly to the problems that we have as a result of Russia's action? Obviously, we're not going to have in a consensus document a condemnation of Russia. But can we talk about the ways that it has driven a tank into those three pillars and find the right language to prevent that or to discourage such behavior and do something to rectify things? Some of that is more easily done. We can talk, for example, on the second pillar about the need to discourage any new state from leaving the treaty and pursuing a weapons program. And that depends both in part in talking about Article 10, the withdrawal clause of the treaty, and in the strongest possible statements from all leaders that we will oppose any new weapons program by a new country, no matter which country it is. That's important. On the third pillar, we can talk about positive security assurances. We can talk about the ways that the members of the treaty, the states party, are committed to addressing nations that suffer radiological risk due to military action against their country. The hard part is in the first pillar, what you say about how the Russian action has damaged not just the credibility of the five, although to be fair, it only damages the credibility of one of the N5 grouping, but has it demeaned the power of security assurances, whether they are legally binding or otherwise. And that's what we ought to be concerned about. And here I'd like to pick up on what Professor Tannenwald said, that the blatant violation of a taboo, the immediate undermining of an otherwise very positive statement by the 5 nuclear weapon states creates an opportunity to strengthen the taboo. And here I have heard many folks, including some in this room, saying the obvious opportunity to strengthen that taboo and make a strong statement is at the review conference. I agree that's logical. It is not, however, realistic, because so far I have not seen a reaction from the rest of the world to the threats that Russia has made. I've heard a lot of NATO leaders say this is unacceptable, but I have not heard the presidents or foreign ministers from countries outside of NATO say this is outrageous. Now, whether that's from a misguided notion that they have to be neutral and not offend Moscow, that's one issue. But the failure to stand up for principles at the highest level of government leads me to have no confidence that folks several layers down in those governments are going to be able to agree on a meaningful statement in New York, nor will it have the same power coming out of a review conference as it could have if, say, 50 or 100 foreign ministers signed a very simple statement saying nothing about Moscow or Kyiv, but simply saying these kinds of threats are unacceptable in the 21st century. Since I don't see that happening, and I see too many countries willing to sacrifice crucial principles of the world order out of a, I think, misjudgment of what geopolitics demands, makes me a little bit pessimistic about addressing that well at the conference. But all of that said, on your second part of your question was specifically Article 6. Our commitment to Article 6 is strong. It was not restated during the previous administration, but the Biden administration has restated it. We know that it involves arms control negotiations. We also believe strongly that it includes risk reduction measures that are incumbent not just in a bilateral context, but among the 5 nuclear weapon states, and that must involve the non-nuclear weapon states as well. Risk reduction is not a substitute for disarmament, but it is the more urgent question, given the development of the last 3 months. And it therefore requires the most urgent action from the review conference. So those are just a couple of points about Article 6, but no one should doubt that the United States recognizes the legally binding obligation to continue to pursue arms reduction and eventual elimination of nuclear arsenals.
So thank you, Tom, for kind of giving us sort of the U.S. perspective about what we might see at the review conference. Jamie, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. When the review conference was scheduled for January, it already promised to be acrimonious. And now, for the various reasons that Tom laid out related to the Russian invasion, it promises to be an even more trying conference. So Tom laid out what he thinks might be possible. I'd love to get your perspective. What could we realistically hope to achieve at the review conference? And what in your mind would make it a success? I know we have to look kind of beyond just the final document as an indicator of success. So what are you going to be looking for?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Kelsey, and to the Arms Control Association for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be a part of the 50th anniversary celebration. So I think these are a really important set of questions, and I'll kind of broadly touch on a couple scene-setting points that hopefully we can dive into some more. But I think ultimately, firstly, we can expect atmospherics are going to be really bad. The Iran nuclear deal is in flux. North Korea is likely going to test a 7th nuclear weapon. We have these strained relations amongst the P5. The TPNW first meeting of states parties will be a month before the RevCon. And as we've discussed, of course, we have Russia's invasion of an NPT-compliant non-nuclear weapon state. And I think this war in particular has really hardened people's positions on nuclear issues. And this is something I've talked quite a lot about with my KCL colleague, Amelia Morgan. But for example, you have on the one hand, nuclear weapon states saying, look, this is why we need deterrence. This is why we need nuclear weapons. Versus you have TPNW supporters, let's say, saying, look, this is why deterrence is risky. This is why we need to get rid of these weapons. So I think all of this will express itself at the RevCon through lots of finger pointing, nasty rights of reply, maybe even delegates walking out during each other's speeches. And so to take quite a cynical approach, I think the prospects for progress are quite low, especially on the disarmament pillar. But that said, fundamentally, no one wants to break the NPT, right? Everybody recognizes it plays a critical role in the global disarmament and nonproliferation architecture. And so I think there's an obvious opportunity to state that quite clearly at the RevCon, and hopefully at high political levels as well. But what else can we realistically expect beyond that kind of low-hanging fruit? Well, I think it's important to think along kind of a spectrum of ambition and really think quite critically about how ambitious we should strive to be in August. And so on the lower end, for example, I think we can expect that there will be language to acknowledge the TPNW, right? I think even nuclear weapon states have come to the point where, there's a recognition we need to do so. However, the question still remains, what exactly will that look like? Kind of moving up in ambition, I think we can certainly expect a continued commitment to cooperation amongst the P3, US, UK, France. But I think there's also an opportunity here for China to demonstrate its commitment to continued cooperation amongst the nuclear weapon states while dialogue with Russia remains unfeasible. Obviously, that will be quite politically challenging for Beijing, but I think it could draw on some of their attempts to demonstrate their leadership in this space. And then finally, on the more ambitious end, and what I'd really consider a success, is if states parties use the RevCon to adopt a forward-looking approach and really set up a successful 2025 review cycle. This gets to Tom's point as well, that we really should be looking forward, right? The 10th RevCon is not the end-all of the NPT. And so I think there's opportunities to really think about what are realistic opportunities for medium-term progress. And I agree that risk reduction is really a critical one there.
So, as you said, risk reduction is a space where we might be able to see some progress. But I think there might also be room in some of the multilateral initiatives that support the NPT, such as the Stockholm Initiative, such as the P5 process. In a piece you wrote for Carnegie in January, you referred to these as NPT adjacent, a term that I thought was very descriptive. So can we look to these types of initiatives for opportunities to reduce risk? And just given the challenges facing the NPT, is the future in these forums as we look to advance arms control and disarmament objectives?
Sure, yeah. So I think these NPT-adjacent forums are critical, right? And kind of for three interrelated reasons. First and foremost, they help to maintain dialogue, especially when the atmospherics are as challenging as they are. Secondly, they're doing a lot of important legwork to kind of set ourselves up for that future success that I mentioned. And thirdly, and somewhere I think there's more room to improve on, is there's great opportunities for coordination and collaboration amongst them, including kind of a division of labor. But of course, I think that all of this work still does need to feed back into the RevCon and the NPT more broadly. Because as challenging as RevCons can be, at the end of the day, that is the gathering where all states parties can really exercise their voice on these issues. But I really think that the bigger question here is, what exactly do we mean by risk reduction? And so Heather Williams wrote a really interesting piece on this recently, but we have a lot of current discussions on risk reduction measures that are really focusing on how can we address misperception, inadvertent escalation, and the like. And I think that's really important and something we should be striving towards. But as the last panel kind of addressed, what happens when a nuclear weapon state is purposely increasing nuclear risks? What are we supposed to do then? And so I think that suggests at the most fundamental level, we really need a serious discussion of what risks are we striving to reduce. And kind of in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and stop there, but I'm happy to go into more detail about the individual groupings and their risk reduction efforts and ways ahead.
So that is a good cue to remind the audience that if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the cards on your table, hold them up. My colleagues will be circulating to pick them up. But now I want to move to the nonproliferation side of things. And we've seen a number of states make threats to pursue nuclear weapons in recent years. And just in December, Foreign Affairs did a survey of experts asking if we'd see the number of nuclear armed states rise in the next 10 years. And I would say expert opinion was fairly mixed. And since then, we've seen the invasion of Ukraine, and that's raised questions about the value of nuclear weapons. The nuclear deal with Iran, whether or not that's going to be restored, that still sort of remains unresolved. So Eric, moving on to you, do you think the risk of proliferation is rising? And if so, what factors do you see driving states to more seriously consider nuclear weapons?
Thank you, Kelsey. First of all, thank you to having me here today, to you and to the Arms Control Association. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I answered that question. I was one of the people who answered that question for Foreign Affairs. And I think my answer was neutral with a high degree of confidence. But I debated between that and yes, there would be proliferation with a low degree of confidence. And I'll kind of actually probably unpack that a little bit in the remainder of this question. But the bottom line is that yes, I do think the risks of proliferation are rising. But of course, the question of whether or not a country or any country really crosses that nuclear threshold, I think depends on a lot of things, and it's not a given. I think the greater risk is that rather than a whole sort of slew of new nuclear weapons possessing states, we end up in a world where more countries either advance or develop the ability to build and deliver nuclear weapons kind of should they choose to do so as a hedge. And we live in this world of more hedgers. And the reason why I'm worried about that is because I think when you take a look at kind of the trend lines and the factors that we all look at and assess when countries, whether or not countries are going to proliferate, a lot of those are moving in the wrong direction. And we've talked about some of those today, but I'll talk about a few more. The first is that, I think there's growing nuclear weapons threats, which we've covered today, and worsening regional security environments. And that's kind of, it's not determinative of proliferation, but it certainly kind of, sows the seeds for some of those risks as countries take a look around and look at the environment that they're living in. I mean, almost all nuclear weapon states are increasing their nuclear arsenals, Russia, China, North Korea. A lot of countries in those regions are also worried about those countries' conventional capabilities. And in the Iran case, we now have an Iran that's, just probably less than a week or about a week away from being able to produce enough material for a weapon. And so I think that's another threat that's out there. And so I think that's something we need to factor into these assessments. And I wouldn't say that Europe is high on my list as an area that I look at for proliferation concerns. NATO is probably the most cohesive and strongest it's been in a while today. But there has been some alarming signals, and I think there was a really good article that was written in the Bulletin recently by Alex Lenoska and Lauren Sukin, who they did a survey of a series of Eastern European countries. And not only did they find strong support for NATO in a lot of them, but of a few, they actually found strong support for national nuclear weapons programs. And I think Poland was one where it was about 2/3 favored or would support developing a national nuclear weapons program. So that's something, again, not determinative. It's not, popular support is not a political decision to produce. And so I don't want to overstate that. But, it's something I think we need to keep our eye on when we talk about these erosions of nonproliferation norms. Looking at Asia, I mean, I think the countries in the region are becoming increasingly concerned about the growing North Korean nuclear threat. I think the threat posed by China as well, and some of the aggressive postures of China. And again, I would point to another study that's been done by Carl Friedhoff, Toby Dalton, and Lamy Kim that, again, surveyed South Koreans, and they found 70% support nuclear weapons. Now, that number is not like higher than we've seen in the past necessarily, but what they did find that's particularly alarming is that when survey participants were asked, would it change your opinion if you were sanctioned or if the U.S. withdrew troops from the peninsula, they said no. It didn't really move the needle for them. So I think when we look at the utility of some of these tools, and I think the factors that are actually driving or inhibiting nuclear weapons proliferation, I think that's another factor we have to look at, and that's a worrying development. And in the Middle East, I already talked about the risk of Iran developing nuclear weapons, and I think, again, a nuclear Iran, but also Iran that's sort of on the cusp, I think is quite worrying when it comes to concerns about proliferation in the region and countries like Saudi Arabia potentially hedging or doing otherwise. The second kind of trend line that I worry about, and it sounds a little weird saying this now, but this was certainly, I think, a debate and a real issue of concern in the Trump administration, which is that I do think that countries remain concerned about U.S. credibility and the credibility of U.S. security commitments. And I think, again, NATO is probably stronger than it's ever been. The Biden administration has done an excellent job, and I think deserves a lot of credit for repairing U.S. alliances in Asia and improving those relationships. But I think this is a longer-term question for a lot of countries. And it's not just about security commitments per se, but it's about the broader question of U.S. leadership in the world. And is the United States going to continue to support and defend the international system that it helped create and lead? And these are longer term questions that I think drive these concerns. And I think the reason why they're worrying is because if you look at history and what's driven countries to pursue or consider nuclear weapons, a big part of it has been, at least for those countries that receive U.S. protection, whether or not they buy into that and view it credible, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Germany, and others. So I think that's another area that bears watching. The final point that I'll highlight here is, and it's one that is kind of hard to get our heads around, but I think there's also a concern, or at least I have a concern, that we may be entering into an era where nonproliferation as a goal is taking a backseat to some other strategic objectives that we have. And this isn't to say we don't care about nonproliferation or we don't prioritize it. I think we do, but as a consequence or an outcome of other choices, right? And we've seen instances of this throughout history, right? We've had periods where we've gone through and cases where we've gone through where other issues have trumped nonproliferation. Israel, Pakistan are two clear-cut examples. But I think in this case, it's perhaps our prioritization of strategic competition, of kind of readying for competition with China and Russia, and doing more to enable our allies and partners to do more for their own defense. And of course, there's definitely a pull element of that as well, that they want to do more. But I think in some instances, some of those choices are in tension with non-proliferation goals. And I'll just highlight two here, but we can talk about more of these later. I mean, I think the ending of the limits on South Korea's missile program in May of last year, which has allowed South Korea to develop longer range solid propellant missiles. And I think was, as mentioned earlier, although not directly related to this, they're developing a conventionally armed SLBM capability. And then, of course, AUKUS and the nuclear-powered submarine arrangement under that, which, I think we have to move forward on that very carefully in a way that sets positive non-proliferation precedents, because it could go in the other direction as well and set some negative precedents that could make it easier for other countries to divert material for nuclear weapons or to embark on enrichment programs to fuel notional nuclear reactors for submarines. And so I'm really pleased to see that the participants in that arrangement have recognized that and are prioritizing non-proliferation as an element of that, because I do think it's important. And none of this is to say, I want to be clear that I'm not arguing we shouldn't prioritize China as a major challenge or threat, or that we shouldn't have done AUKUS or we shouldn't have done some of these other things. All I'm saying is that I think we need to be more deliberate, and I think probably both inside and outside of government, to think about the consequences, the non-proliferation consequences of some of these decisions, and think about how to best mitigate them.
Thanks, Eric. I mean, I certainly agree with you on the risks. Well, actually, I think I agreed with everything you said. But to highlight a few things.
Don't commit yourself to everything.
Well, I did disagree on one thing. I answered the Foreign Affairs survey as well, and I think I said no, but low confidence. So we had some divergence there. But I certainly agree with you on, want to highlight, the risk of new states engaging in hedging activity, the tension between non-proliferation priorities and other priorities. And I think that raises the question then, well, is the US playbook adequate for guarding against some of these hedging concerns? I mean, you mentioned AUKUS, you mentioned South Korea. We now have Iran enriching to 60%. I mean, that raises concerns about whether or not higher levels of enrichment will become a norm. So my question is, are there steps that you think the United States and the international community could be taking to better prevent proliferation, to try to guard against some of this hedging, or do you think the current playbook is adequate?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the way that I've been trying to think about this is kind of along these lines. It's what is the future proliferation environment going to look like, and where will threats stem from? Is it going to look like the past 30 years, roughly, where threats primarily stem from so-called rogue states, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Libya, Iraq, in an environment where countries are trying to hide their capabilities, where it's a unipolar era, where the U.S. has a lot of ability to drive the discussion and drive the agenda, and for those who don't want to go along, pull them along kicking and screaming, perhaps in some cases. Is it going to look like that environment where the kind of the name of the game for U.S. policy is, as you sort of described, coercive diplomacy and trying to kind of pressure countries and leaders to make a change in assessments about their programs and be willing to put constraints on them? Is it going to look like that, or is it going to look like, I don't know, maybe the 30-ish years before that, right, where proliferation challenges stemmed, not just from so-called rogue states, but from a variety of different other types of countries, allies, partners, countries that don't fit neatly into one category or the other, eras where the United States' power and influence is not unrivaled and not unchallenged. And I would argue it's probably not going to fit either of those worlds precisely, and obviously that's a bit of an artificial distinction. But I think I'm worried it's going to look more like the former, the pre-Cold War era, than the last 30 years. And I'm worried that we're not thinking about that, we're not quite prepared for that type of world where some of these other tools that we've developed and honed and used over the past 30 years, and the other one I didn't talk about, some of the more counter-proliferation-oriented tools, sabotage, interdictions, and so on, those aren't going to be as useful in this coming era, right? And I think if we look back again in the 1970s and 1980s, where we had challenges of proliferation from countries like Taiwan and South Korea, it was a serious effort to unwind those programs, as I'm sure many of you know, and have probably lived through in some cases, right? It was a real challenge to take those back. It took decades. And it took the United States putting some pretty severe consequences on the table as part of those efforts, including removing US troops, including ending civil nuclear cooperation. And so I think it's an open question whether we would be able to or would be willing to put some of those consequences on the table today if we ever encountered similar types of situations. And there's, of course, a debate as well as to whether we should. And I think the other area that has me concerned about this in terms of tools is that perhaps our most valuable tool, which has been diplomacy and our ability to negotiate and conclude and sustain arms control and nonproliferation agreements, is coming under strain in the future. And I worry part of that's because of the US domestic political scene right now and what's the types of agreements that are sort of sought after and the maximalist nature of some of those agreements. But also I think concern of parties who would enter into these agreements about the US ability to sustain commitments and the concern that those commitments could dissolve over the course of one election. And the second part of that I think is US cooperation with Russia and China on nonproliferation, I think is going to become harder. I don't think it's one of those issues that we can kind of just assume will be walled off from the other tensions and from this sort of more competitive environment. I think we're going to have to make a real deliberate effort to sustain that, and that's something that I believe we should do. Just a couple sort of concluding sort of recommendations on how do we manage this environment. I think I would go back to what I said at the outset, which is one, I think we need to have a bigger debate, a bigger discussion, and a strategy discussion about what is this environment going to look like and what does the United States, our allies, and the international community need to do to manage that. On Iran, in particular, the real concern that Iran could remain at this threshold capability or develop nuclear weapons, I think means, we need to try and return to the Jcpoa as soon as possible or figure out another way, another agreement to limit Iran's program because of the concerns that could be incredibly damaging to the nonproliferation regime and potentially lead to follow-on proliferation. And I think on top of that, which we can talk about more in the Q&A, I think we also have to pivot to focusing on an agreement, a regionally driven set of solutions that can likewise provide limits on certain nuclear activities and added transparency. And so I'm probably over time, so I'll just stop there and we can discuss the rest during Q&A.
Well, if you were over time, I did not notice because excellent comments. So I know I'm going to turn to questions from the floor. I already have a few. If you have more questions, please feel free to write them on the cards on your table. And then if you hold them up, my colleagues, Gabriella and Leanne, will be circulating to collect them. So thank you to those of you who have already submitted questions. I'm going to start with one about the P5. So what do you see as possible at the review conference specifically by the P5 collectively? Something that could be done without normalizing Russian behavior. And there's a specific question here about whether or not a reiteration of the Reagan-Gorbachev formulation would be like would that be a cynical exercise given Russian nuclear threats? So Tom, Jamie, I don't know if you would like to weigh in on that action that the P5 might be able to take collectively?
I don't know, and I say that with high confidence. The P5 did some great work, I think, between 2009 and 2015. Did very little of value until last year. And we had a reasonably good meeting of the group in December in Paris, and it led to a number of statements intended for discussion at the RevCon, including a declaration by 4 presidents and a prime minister that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And while most of the world focused on that sentence, I urge everyone to read the entire one-page statement because it has much else of value, including an explicit statement that nuclear weapons are for defensive purposes only. And that should matter as well in the current environment. The same considerations about Russia's not just violation but detonation of important international norms means that if we can't do the higher priority strategic stability dialogue at this moment, it's a lot harder to do the lower priority, although lower visibility, P5 process. So I can't predict at this point whether the P5 will have something meaningful to say as a group at the review conference other than the important statements we made in December and January that are already put forward. Now, by the way, the United States yesterday assumed the chairmanship of this group for the next year or so. One of the things that we'd like to do is to talk about the N5 rather than the P5 to distinguish the particular role of nuclear weapon states under the NPT from the particular role of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. But I also recognize that interchangeably we'll be saying P5 and N5 for a while. The fun thing about the 5 is the negotiation of a joint statement on any topic. And what you end up with is a lowest common denominator statement, which sometimes is still pretty good, better than no statement at all. The good news, or again, a silver lining of the current situation, is that the 3, France, United Kingdom, and the United States, can say some meaningful things, and their lowest common denominator is going to be not nearly as low as the common denominator at 5. So I think that you will see some useful statements from the 3, some useful initiatives. There is certainly, I think, an imperative for the 3 of us to distinguish ourselves from the irresponsible behavior of a nuclear weapon state that we've seen. And since China was mentioned, I think it is useful to maintain the distinction between the irresponsible behavior by a nuclear power in the case of Russia, and to remind ourselves we have not seen that same level of irresponsibility from China, although we have other criticisms of them. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I think, a great opportunity for the P3 to demonstrate their cooperation and, efforts to continue this intersessional progress. Perhaps they could host kind of a smaller version of the doctrine side event that originally the P5 had committed towards, which I really just don't see as politically feasible in August. Something to think about as well is, if you can't be operating in this grouping, are there opportunities for, these individual nuclear weapon states to be making unilateral reaffirmations? I certainly would agree that doing so in concert carries a bit more weight. But again, while the politics are hard, is that an opportunity? Of course, the question then comes up, should we still be questioning the credibility of these commitments when we're seeing one of the nuclear weapon states invading a non-nuclear weapon state? And just to add one more thing kind of outside of the RevCon itself, I think the P5's commitment after the December meeting to create a young professionals network is a great opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to supporting, cooperation and coordination amongst the P5 at the track 2 level. And really encouraging the next gen to be continuing these conversations when they're not quite feasible at the track 1.5 or track 1 levels, I think is a great way to demonstrate a continued commitment to looking forward.
And I think that group has its first meeting next week.
So I'm now going to turn to North Korea, and maybe I'll ask you to weigh in on this first, Eric, but Tom and Jamie, if you want to jump in afterwards, feel free. So this question is, how significant is the failure to impose further sanctions on North Korea? And I assume this might be referring to recent Security Council efforts led by the United States that were vetoed after North Korea's recent missile launches. And does the vastly diverging interests of the permanent members of the UN Security Council mean that the costs of proliferation are now lower? And could this trend drive further proliferation?
That's a good question. So we'll take the example of the recent sort of fracture of the UN Security Council over the proposal that was put forward to increase sanctions on North Korea in response to the series of ICBM tests. I mean, on the one hand, I do think that is significant, and that is kind of the first time that that's happened, I think, since 2006, where Russia and China vetoed one of those resolutions. So from that standpoint, it's I think, an important marker and indicator of where things stand. And I think it certainly signals that resolutions down the road are going to continue to be difficult and challenging for those same reasons. I think, I think there was a comment by a Chinese official that said that the United States is, unhelpfully forcing this discussion now because it's sort of seeing things through this lens of its conflict with China and Russia. I mean, there's probably an element of truth to that, but there's also, it's kind of like look in the mirror, right, in this case too, because I think China and Russia are also viewing these dynamics through similar lenses. And so, I'm also, unfortunately, I'm a little skeptical that, even if there was another nuclear test by North Korea, that you'd see, I'm sure you'd have another resolution, or I bet you'd have another resolution probably, condemning the test, maybe some type of additional sanctions in place, maybe, but I don't think it's as automatic as it used to be because of these new types of tensions that have cropped up in the relationship and that now pervade the Security Council. So I think that that's going to be a challenge moving forward. And is that going to mean that other proliferators will sort of take away that they can move forward without consequences? Perhaps. I mean, but I'm not sure that is really going to be a determining factor about whether a future country will or will not move forward, but it certainly doesn't help that calculus.
So I should have apologized in advance if I butcher the wording on anybody's question. I really thought if I read my father's handwriting, I could read everybody else's, but a few of these have been a bit challenging, perhaps because I've been so used to typing in the virtual world of the pandemic. But I want to now perhaps combine nonproliferation and the NPT a bit more directly for this next question, which is, what are the implications for the NPT review conference if the JCPOA has not been restored by then? I mean, certainly we could see that as another flashpoint. So I will open the panel to who might want to weigh in on that.
Dramatically significant. The review conference has not been, will not be this time, a place where the fate of the JCPOA and the strategic direction of Iran are decided. But certainly, to get back to the JCPOA, which should be in the common interest of everybody who does not want to see a new war in the Middle East. If we fail to get back to it, it will hurt the atmosphere. But does it dramatically change an outcome document? I don't think so.
Would either of you like to weigh in?
I'd probably agree. And just, get back to my point of there's a lot of challenges that are going to make for a difficult atmosphere at RevCon, obviously the JCPOA being one of them. But, we're facing a lot. So I think it's not going to be the end all be all.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, the JCPOA, I think, obviously there's a lot of different views on that, on the deal. In my mind, it still remains the least unattractive option for the United States when it comes to limiting Iran's nuclear program. I take the point of folks who say that, Changes over time have made it less useful, right? It's not quite the deal that it was in 2015. But when you look at the available alternatives that are out there, it still strikes me as the best among them. And moreover, if you are concerned about all of these other nuclear challenges we've talked about, North Korea, if you want to prioritize China as the biggest challenge in the United States, and you want to pivot to Asia, it strikes me that taking a deal that, even if not the perfect deal, is nevertheless quite good at limiting Iran's program and adding a lot of transparency to that program, it strikes me that that is the best strategic choice. So that's kind of the way that I've been thinking about it. And I would agree with my colleagues' comments on the NPT review conference. The only other comment I would make, because this is somewhat relevant to Iran as well, I think this idea of Iran sort of at the cusp of a nuclear weapon, or this risk that there might be additional nuclear hedgers out there, I think that poses additional challenges for disarmament as well. And having to grapple with that blurry line, right, between sort of purely peaceful and weapons looks like, I think that could potentially be more challenging to advance the disarmament goals that we have.
So staying on the topic of the NPT, maybe Jamie, maybe I'd ask you to take kind of the first stab at this question. The question is, will too much focus on the condemnation of Russia's actions create new dividing lines at the NPT, further undermining the prospects for its relative success? So I think we discussed a lot about why it's important to condemn Russia, but I think asking about the consequences is important. So what do you think?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a big possibility. I certainly agree with the comments that have been made that there needs to be a clear condemnation of Russia's behavior and actions, again, against an NPT-compliant non-nuclear weapon state. That said, getting to my point of it's really important to preserve the NPT. So I think we still do need to focus on areas for opportunity and progress to ensure that, RevCon doesn't, implode the treaty, which, to be clear, I don't think it will. But to really safeguard our efforts and make sure that, our progress isn't derailed, which, touches on the point as well of making sure that the RevCon is kind of insulated from external semi-tangential issues. So for example, I think AUKUS could come up from the Chinese delegation saying, look, we have concerns that US, UK, and Australia are challenging non-proliferation norms and things. And certainly, that's a topic of discussion, but I don't think that these external issues should derail the progress and focus on the 3 pillars of the treaty and doing, a good faith review of the treaty, as Tom mentioned.
Yeah, if I could, 2 points on that. First, I agree, and it follows also on what both Nina and Jamie have said, that yes, a frontal assault on the key concepts of the treaty by the Russian Federation, it makes everything harder, but it is also an opportunity. And I think it reinforces what most nations should feel, that this is not just a routine review conference, one in a series. This is happening at a moment when basic tenets of the treaty are being actively undermined, and therefore there is a greater need than ever to come to the defense of the treaty, to reiterate that it is not just relevant, but important and central to the global rules-based order, and that we are determined to strengthen it against all challenges. So as difficult as Russia's war has made it, it actually gives me a little bit of optimism that states are going to focus on that central goal of keeping the treaty strong, vibrant, and in the forefront of leaders' minds, rather than quibbling about whether we have done enough on this topic or that topic. The second thought about this question is, yes, Russia deserves to be condemned for reasons, as I said, that go well above the level of the NPT. But there has to be clear in people's minds a separation in concept and in timing between condemnation of Russia and strengthening of the norms of the treaty. You should be condemning the hell out of Russia every place outside of the review conference, and especially before the review conference, as I said earlier. But when you get in the hall and you are talking about a consensus document, that's not where you're going to write condemnation of anybody. You are going to write about principles, about strengthening norms. And you're going to do that without mentioning names if you're going to have a successful document. So keeping that distinction in concept and in timing between condemnation of what has happened and a positive program to help ensure it doesn't happen anymore is important. One more quick concept on AUKUS. Of course, we will talk about AUKUS at the NPT. China will raise AUKUS in New York, in Vienna, in Geneva, at the climate change conference, at the conference on fish migration. They will raise it everywhere. They will hope, vainly, that we do not raise the facts about who has introduced more nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear missiles into the Pacific than anyone else. It will be an entertaining conversation, but it's also an opportunity for us to demonstrate, as Eric mentioned, that the three AUKUS partners are committed to establishing the highest possible standard for non-proliferation in the context of naval propulsion, and that we will be utterly cooperative with the IAEA.
So this next question sort of combines two questions from the audience, and I might direct this at you first, Eric. To what extent should we be concerned about the actions that Saudi Arabia is taking, given its nuclear threats in the past and its involvement with China? And is the Middle East WMD free zone likely to be a contentious issue at the NPT review conference? And is that an option to counter proliferation threats that we might see rising in the Middle East? So, Eric, whatever part of that, all of that you'd like to respond to kick
Great
it
question.
off.
Maybe I'll leave the questions about the review conference to my colleagues. But no, I mean, I think, when you look at the sort of the cast of characters, right, and where they rank on your concern, I think Saudi Arabia is certainly on that list for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, as I think you alluded to at the outset of this, Kelsey, members of the Saudi leadership have openly talked about how they will develop nuclear weapons if Iran does. And so as Iran inches up that capability ladder, I think that's one reason to watch, although it's notable that they haven't said anything in quite some time, so perhaps they found those comments not terribly useful, as they did at least at the outset. So there's the Iran factor and the statements they've made publicly that I think bear watching. But of course, we've seen reports about Saudi Arabia developing indigenous ballistic missile production capability, which of course is not nuclear, right? There's no direct linkage, but that is another, because of the potential future delivery capability and role that could serve, I think it's something that bears watching. And I think the other issue that is concerning is I think the current, Saudi Arabia could certainly be doing more to provide transparency on its nuclear program. And I think the big thing there is rescinding the small quantities protocol and applying the additional protocol. And Saudi's been quite reluctant to adopt the AP, and it's been quite reluctant to limit and forswear in any capacity enrichment and reprocessing. And so I think steps on those issues I think would certainly be positive. And so those are the types of things I would look for that would certainly provide some reassurance and take it further down that list of countries of concern.
Thanks. So then on the Middle East zone, opportunity at the NPT review conference, flashpoints. I mean, I think we all remember that in 2015, it actually was the Middle East WMD free conference, or Middle East WMD free zone conference that prevented consensus. So Jamie, Tom, do you have thoughts on how we might see this issue come up in August?
Well, I'd say I think we can expect it will come up again, but there has been some intersessional efforts since 2015 to address the issue. There's been a dedicated conference meeting, I believe in person before everything at some point. But again, I would just reiterate, I think we need to make sure that there's not one single issue that derails the conference in the larger effort that we should be using, August to really be strengthening the NPT and the broader regime.
Tom?
I do not expect it to derail the conference.
Okay, well, a possible point of optimism. So we have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to end on this question, and I'll give everybody a chance to weigh in. So maybe Jamie, we'll start with you and just work down the row. So Adam Scheinman was interviewed in this most recent issue of Arms Control Today, and he said that past NPT review conference commitments are political, that only the treaty is binding and we should not lose time debating history. So the question is, why should anyone care about NPT commitments?
I'm so glad I get to go first. Yeah, so again, past commitments is another issue that is brought up a lot in the NPT space, and I can expect will be brought up again at RevCon. And just to kind of give more depth to the conversation, so you kind of have, some states saying, past commitments are important, they're very representative of the time. However, so we should be looking forward and seeing, how can we implement the spirit of the treaty and, those legal obligations. And then on the other hand, you have states saying, look, if we aren't following these past commitments that have been reached by consensus, certainly we're undermining the NPT. So I think that's a very critical point of tension that is honestly quite challenging to address. And so, I'll perhaps problematically just fall back onto, my area for largest ambition is, looking forward and how can we collectively strive to strengthen this treaty. Hope I avoided that well enough.
Tom?
Well, first, you should read Ambassador Scheinman's interview because he explains it, I think, better than I do. But the essential points are a treaty obligation, what is written, signed, and ratified, is binding and eternal. A commitment made at a review conference is political, it is important, it is relevant, and at least speaking for the United States, when that commitment is made, it is sincerely made with the intent to carry it out. I have to agree that arguing about what we meant when we said this in 2000 is a less productive exercise than what we need to focus on in the next 5 years. And it is the business of diplomats to find the right wording that will reassure others. Myself, I think it's a little more of a theological and semantic exercise, but I also respect the fact that a number of states parties feel very deeply about this issue, and therefore we have to address it. We have to find the right language that reassures people, but that also recognizes from the point of view of the United States that 2022 is not 1995.
So I'm not a lawyer, nor an expert on international law, and so, as I've been reminded by people who actually are. But no, I mean, I agree with my colleagues. I mean, look, political doesn't mean irrelevant, right? It's not a ding, right? It's not an insult, or at least I wouldn't perceive it as an insult. So just saying that they're political does not mean they're irrelevant, as Tom said, they're quite relevant. So, but I also agree that looking forward to the future is the most productive way, and thinking about, given where we are, what is the most productive way to strengthen the treaty is the right approach at the end of the day.
Well, I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions, but thank you for submitting your questions. My thanks to the panelists for a very rich discussion.